This year marks the 75th anniversary of the Society for Vascular Surgery, the world's oldest and largest professional society dedicated to the care of patients with vascular disease. This year I had the good fortune to serve as SVS president, the 5th president from Stanford, and the history of the organization at our annual meeting in August. My presidential address focused on a viable and vibrant future for our organization. I thought this presentation would make a good follow-up to my departmental presentation last year at one of our cultural complications conferences on the origins and consequences of the #MedBikini controversy surrounding the Journal of Vascular Surgery and by extension the SVS during my tenure as president. To understand why the future of the SVS is important to the American healthcare system, a brief background on the origins and history of the society is instructive. The SVS is the society for the specialty, the professional society that created the modern specialty of vascular surgery. The SVS was the vision of Dr. J. Ross Veal of New Orleans, later Washington, D.C. At Veal's urging, a group of like-minded general surgeons met to discuss the concept at the Southern Surgical Meeting in 1945. The initial organizational meeting for the SVS was held the Sunday before the annual meeting of the American Medical Association in San Francisco in 1946, and the first clinical meeting the subsequent year in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Listed on the slide are the 31 charter members of the Society for Vascular Surgery. The members in yellow as a group coined the name Society for Vascular Surgery, recognizing that improvements were needed in surgical techniques and instrumentation for vascular reconstruction. Ochsner, Holman, DeTakis, and Veal were elected the first group of officers, respectively. In 1951, more than 800 physicians were attending the annual meeting. The early history of the SVS has been extensively chronicled. Some key references are listed on the slide. The late Harris Schumacher, the last surviving charter member, chronicled the proceedings of the first nearly 40 SVS meetings in his retrospective, which provided much of the background for this presentation. For those who are interested, additional historical resources can be found on the website, vascular.org. Vision and commitment were needed to launch a professional society dedicated to an entirely new medical specialty. But just as our nation has changed tremendously in the ensuing decades, so too has the SVS and the specialty it created. James Y.S.T. Yao, or Jimmy to his friends, Emeritus Professor of Vascular Surgery and Division Chief at Northwestern, has published extensively on the history of vascular surgery. Jimmy segments this history into decades of accomplishment. First decade is the breakthrough decade with the introduction of arterial reconstructive surgery. The second decade, growth of operative procedures, selective arteriography, and prosthetic grafts. The SVS establishes its first Guidelines Committee for the study of prosthetic grafts. Emmerich Szilagyi, who was at Henry Ford Hospital, presented the American Surgical using an early form of propensity matching and life table analysis that on the basis of their 15-year history, removal of an abdominal aortic aneurysm was found to approximately double a patient's life expectancy. The third decade was non-invasive vascular testing, ultrasound, CT, MRI. The fourth decade, widespread adoption of vascular fellowship training, establishing board certification, launch of the Journal of Vascular Surgery and the SVS Foundation, and the initiation of the SVS NHLBI co-sponsored training grants for vascular surgeon scientists. The fifth decade, rapid evolution and improvement of endovascular technology. The sixth decade, merger of two major American vascular societies into a single SVS, the evolution of the SVS to member services organization, and endo retraining for veteran surgeons. The seventh decade, rapid transition to outpatient treatment, quality outcome focused development of the PSO-VQI and a nationwide vascular registry. And now, looking forward another 75 years, what will come next? Representative images like these annotate the history of vascular surgery. This is my 1987 University of Washington surgical residency composite, the 1994 Executive Board of the Society for Vascular Surgery with Emeritus faculty member Dr. Fogarty as president, the 2001 composite of Stanford Vascular Surgery, Some of you may recognize those individuals in that picture. Myself, Dr. Olcott, Frank Garco, Chris Ahrens, Tom Fogarty, Scott Mitchell, John Mahegan, Brad Hill, Craig Miller, Peter Schubart, John Harris. Nearly all white, with or without the coats, nearly all male, and not remarkable in that way in their respective contexts, but the world was and is changing. As we all know, who we will be looks a whole lot different than who we have been. The Census Bureau projects that minorities together will constitute the majority of the population by 2042, up from 2045, as was estimated when these graphics were created for the Brookings Institution. Because minority populations trend younger, the figure in the upper screen right shows time frames, in the upper screen left shows time frames during which minorities together become the majority by decade of age. These changes are being driven both by immigration and existing population, as seen on shifts as seen on the lower left. And finally, in the lower right-hand corner, we can see how population growth and migrations are changing the regional and ethnic racial makeup of the United States. We see these trends here already in California, where 1/3 of adults are born outside the United States. Developing a representative healthcare workforce now will help us better prepare for this future. Hannah Valentine, a Stanford transplant cardiologist, recently completed her term as Chief Officer for Scientific Workforce Diversity at the National Institutes of Health. This slide summarizes her assessment. The health of underrepresented minorities, URMs, is optimized when physicians from concordant backgrounds, underrepresented medicine, or URIM, are involved in their care. This message was reinforced recently regarding COVID-19 vaccination by SVS member Lee Kirksey and colleagues from the Cleveland Clinic. In the vascular workforce, and the SVS by extension is evolving as well. Data from this year's member census underscores this point. As of 2021, more than 50% of our members are younger than 50 years of age, and 23% are women. This compares favorably to women as a fraction of the surgical workforce overall, based on data from the American College of Surgeons shown at the bottom of the slide. The convergence of youth in female gender in vascular surgery is especially apparent from the figure on the left. More than 1/3 of SVS members younger than 30 are women, as compared to 3% in my age group, and more than 1/3 are non-white, regardless of age. We've all been through a lot this year, but we've learned a lot as well. As Kim Brooks wrote in the New York Times, pandemics make visible what's been hidden. Dr. Samuel Kuntz is familiar to most of you as a prior Stanford surgery resident and subsequent faculty transplant surgeon. What you may not know, however, is that early in his career, Dr. Kuntz was a pioneering vascular surgeon as well. Of his many firsts, Dr. Kuntz was the first black surgeon to present his research before the Society for Vascular Surgery at the 16th annual meeting held in June 1962 in Chicago. His mentor and co-author for that presentation was Roy Cohn, the inaugural holder of my endowed professorship, the Chichester Chair. Dr. Kuntz presented and published extensively in the early 1960s on aortic and visceral surgery and indirect methods of blood flow measurement. These were still the formative years of... Go ahead and mute that, thanks. These were still the formative years of vascular surgery. The SVS annual meeting featured presentations ranging from the natural history of arteriovenous fistulae to surgical prevention of pulmonary embolism to advances in the safety and reliability of cardiopulmonary bypass. In an era of surgical giants, Kuntz was a prolific contributor. This picture depicts Drs. Kuntz and Cohn with an early kidney transplant donor-recipient patient pair, and representative publications for Dr. Kuntz demonstrating his vascular surgical interests, including the manuscript from the 1962 SVS presentation outlined in red. In 1967, Kuntz was recruited to UCSF as Chief of Kidney Transplantation, and with colleagues John Najarian and Volkert Belzar, built UCSF into the nation's leader in renal transplantation. By the early 1970s, Kuntz had personally performed 25% of all kidney transplants completed up to that date in the United States. After being recruited to SUNY Downstate as chair of surgery in 1972, Kuntz suffered a debilitating stroke and died in 1981 at age 51. Intrigued by vascular surgery and vascular disease management, as evidenced by his early investigations, Kuntz's career developed in another direction. I'm embarrassed to say that the records of the SVS don't tell us who was the first black member, but it wasn't Dr. Samuel Kuntz because he never joined. Or more likely was never asked to join, as far as we can tell. His membership was by invitation in the early years. By failing to encourage and include talents like Kuntz's, how many others' contributions have been overlooked or lost to the detriment of our patients and the specialty of vascular surgery? The historical record is somewhat more complete, but only slightly more satisfactory when it comes to women. Helen Taussig was the first woman to present at an SVS meeting in 1950. The title of her presentation, Differential Diagnosis of Cyanotic Malformations Amenable to Surgery. She attended and spoke at the invitation of charter member Al Blaylock. By 1983, still a very selective organization, the SVS had 489 male members and 1 female member, Dr. Nina Starr-Brunwald. Dr. Brunwald was a spectacularly talented and pioneering cardiothoracic surgeon, implanting the world's first prosthetic mitral valve of her own design at the NIH Medical Center in Bethesda in 1960 at the age of 32. It took 40 years following the founding of the SVS for the first female vascular surgeons to become members. 20 years later, there were 12 women vascular surgeons in the SVS. These pioneers included Drs. Brophy, Cantelmo, Secret, Freischlag, Gatton, Graham, Harrington, Kilowich, Laura, Riley, Rockman, and Shortell. By 2013, when Julie Freischlag became president, the first woman president, women accounted for approximately 8% of the membership. At the lower right are several current women members and leaders of the SVS. Included in this group from the left are Drs. Karen Wu from UCLA, Misty Humphreys, program director at UC Davis, Shireen Shaloub, a funded expert in inherited aortopathy from the University of Washington, Bernadette Olivola, chief of vascular surgery at Loyola in Chicago and a past visiting professor and grand round speaker here at Stanford, and Dawn Coleman, the Handelman professor and program director at the University of Michigan. Dr. Coleman's also a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army Reserves who earlier this year finished her 3rd combat tour in the Army, 4 months in theater in Afghanistan. During my presidential term this year, we received plenty of feedback regarding the state of the SVS and the perceived value of SVS membership to a rapidly diversifying surgical workforce. The concerns expressed by many are valid. Recognition and leadership opportunities for younger members, underrepresented minorities, and women in the SVS have until recently been elusive. This may partly be due to relative underrepresentation, especially at more senior career levels, but problematic social factors and cultural norms also need to be acknowledged and addressed. Central among these social factors is the persistent perception that leadership abilities are differentiated on the basis of gender and race. This perception leads to so-called insecurities in women and minorities as they progress in their careers, otherwise known as the imposter syndrome. At the outset, early career women today commonly receive professional encouragement and support. As they advance, however, opportunities for these same women often diminish. Sometimes interpreted as a pipeline issue, this phenomenon has spawned many well-intentioned initiatives dedicated to fixing the women, including conferences on mentoring, negotiation, effective communication, leadership, and yes, overcoming the imposter syndrome. So is the imposter syndrome a real hurdle for women, as suggested on the bottom left? Or just a euphemism for the bias and sexism that make their professional journeys more difficult, top left. Jan Heemstra, professor of chemistry at Emory, succinctly summarized the situation recently on Twitter. I look forward to a day, she wrote, when discussions around being a woman in science are less about dealing with bias, harassment, bullying, sexism, self-doubt, invisible work, etc., and are more about discussing science. A reciprocal phenomenon is a perception that men, by their nature and cultural acclimation, make better leaders. The Harvard Business Review addressed this form of implicit bias in top right Why so many incompetent men become leaders, top left I guess that is, emphasizing the fact that with aspiring male leaders particularly, confidence may often be confused with competence, leading to organizational underperformance. Science and medicine rely heavily on precedent and hierarchy. The convergence of female gender and youth in medicine more broadly contributed to the enormous social media response to the professionalism manuscript retracted from the Journal of Vascular Surgery that came in many ways to define my year as president of the SVS. On Twitter, more than 50,000 tweets included the now iconic hashtag #MedBikini, including this graphic, bottom left, from Shireen Obu-Obi, or @Shirley Whirl, a PGY3 resident in Chicago. Screen right, sorry. On the top panel is traditional medicine's interpretation of what constitutes unprofessional behavior, and on the bottom, actions by senior physicians that younger colleagues find unprofessional from their perspective. Clearly, we have a way to go in helping minorities, LGBTQ women, and younger members feel welcome and valued as both colleagues and leaders in vascular surgery and medicine as a whole. Cultural barriers may also prevent us from recognizing and leveraging talent in a changing society. Whereas we often look for passion in applicants as a predictor of career potential and future success, Helen Marcus and colleagues, writing this year in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, identified passion or perceived lack of it as a blind spot among gatekeepers in U.S. education and employment. Analyzing data from over 1.2 million students in 59 countries taking the International Student Assessment Exam, Marcus's team used student ratings of their interest, enjoyment, and self-efficacy in science, reading, and math to gauge their level of passion. Western, educated, industrialized, and democratic nations see the self as independent and the source of motivation. Collectivist societies, on the other hand, see the self as interdependent, part of a web of relations, roles, and responsibilities. According to Marcus, the individualistic model of motivation, although more familiar, is not objectively better. In the U.S., doing well because of what others expect may seem to be evidence of a lack of potential, a sign of coercion or insincerity. But interdependent forms of motivation can be a form of empowerment, persistence, and resilience. Commenting on Marcus's findings, Jeffrey Cohn, professor of education and psychology at Stanford, stated, "We will be better able to unlock the potential of our students and our workforce if we have a broader and more enriched understanding of what drives people to succeed from a wider range of backgrounds." In her provocatively titled essay, "Whose Culture Has Capital?" Tara Yasso, professor of education at the University of California, pointed out that skills inherent to immigrant communities, specifically aspirational, linguistic, familial, social, and navigational talents, as well as resilience, comprise a reservoir of cultural wealth that can predict and enable personal and professional success in individuals from non-traditional backgrounds. Surgical skill, courage, compassion, and commitment to the patient are not gendered, racially, or culturally differentiated traits. When URIM minorities, women, and LGBTQ SVS members are met with disappointment and career frustrations, unless processes are fair and fully transparent, suspicions may arise as to which considerations determined their fate. Was the opportunity they sought not a good fit, as it's so often described, or did ethnic, gender, racial, or sexual orientation discrimination influence the outcome? In his final book, entitled "Where Do We Go From Here?", Dr. Martin Luther King wrote, "One of the most agonizing problems of the human experience is how to deal with disappointment. These reactions poison the soul and scar the personality. The only healthy answer lies in one's honest recognition of disappointment while still clinging to hope, one's acceptance of finite disappointment while embracing infinite hope." In my own case, I was disappointed not to succeed Dr. Krummel as chair of our Department of Surgery. As everybody will agree, however, Dr. Hahn has proven herself to be a capable and visionary leader, an excellent department chair by any metric of assessment, and I've moved on to additional opportunities both inside and outside Stanford, including the ability to serve as president of the SVS this past year. So while I recognize and acknowledge the considerable privilege I enjoy as a heterosexual white male professional American in the early 21st century, I too have some experiential basis for accepting finite disappointment while embracing infinite hope. Vascular surgeons, both individually and collectively, represent a potent force for good. Preventing strokes, amputations, premature death. We may be a small specialty numerically, but we are mighty. To paraphrase Winston Churchill, rarely in the course of history have so many received so much benefit from so few. The SVS is working hard to ensure that our organization remains worthy of the specialty we serve. Substantial progress has been made in all 6 domains of the SVS strategic plan this past year. In the quality domain, led by Council Chair Larry Kreis and Group Leader Karen Wu, work on our claudication acceptable use criteria is establishing benchmark indications for intervention in this controversial area. In the past 2 years, we've published 10 separate clinical practice guidelines. We launched our vascular surgery, vascular quality, VCVQIP quality improvement program for site accreditation, and we acquired the American College of Cardiology Peripheral Vascular Disease Registry and integrated into VQI, adding over 170 new sites to VQI in the process. In research, led by Council Chair Ida Zhang and Basic and Translational Research Committee Chair Luke Brewster, we, along with the larger surgical community, convinced the NIH to reduce surgeons' efforts on K awards to 50%, making this critical funding mechanism more realistic for our early career investigators. And looking forward, we are updating our research priorities for a new decade of discovery. Common to nearly all these new priorities are an enhanced focus on patient-centered approaches, shared decision-making, and precision medicine. In advocacy, led by Council Chair Matt Seidelman and Government Relations Committee Chair Megan Tracy, we joined the American College of Surgeons Surgical Care Coalition to achieve relief for vascular surgeons from surgical reimbursement revaluation this past January. In the process, we garnered nearly $200,000 in PAC contributions and sent nearly 3,000 letters to members of Congress from 450 individual members, a record response from the SVS for any advocacy initiative. In education, led by Council Chair Robbie Chair and Education Committee Chair Kelly Brown, we launched our online learning management system, graduated the first class of our own leadership development program, and transitioned our educational joint venture with UCLA into a new and more inclusive collaboration under the leadership of SVS course co-directors Audra Duncan and David Rigberg. In practice management and support, led by Council Chair Bill Schutz, we created a new task force on population health and transitioned the Community Practice Committee, led by Dan McDivitt, into a section to increase the visibility, voice, and engagement of this important SVS constituency and leadership activities. Despite this overall progress, given everything that's transpired this year, organizational health presented special challenges. Considering the symbiotic relationship between vascular surgery and the SVS, this becomes an existential consideration. Quite simply, we cannot grow and thrive as a specialty without a healthy and vibrant SVS. Incoherence, according to Dr. Tom Naska of the ACGME, is one of the 5 I's of the pandemic, along with inequality, intolerance, incivility, and inhumanity. As COVID upended life early in the spring of 2020, we moved quickly to update, coordinate, and cohere member communications. Under the leadership of SVS Secretary Amy Reed, Chair of Vascular Surgery at the University of Minnesota and another prior Stanford Surgery Grand Round speaker, SVS Communications now speaks clearly with one voice on issues of importance to members, their patients, and society at large. I cannot stress enough how overdue this coordination was and how effective it has proven to be in keeping membership updated and engaged with SVS initiatives. The SVS owes Secretary Reed and member volunteers listed on this slide our thanks for their contributions to the successful evolution of our communications enterprise. The bidirectional nature of many of these initiatives, including the Town Hall Series, SVS Connect, and SVS Tweet Chats, have helped us keep abreast of member concerns and feedback. For our journals, this year we significantly expanded and diversified their editorial teams. Dr. Olka Sachdev-Oates joined the Journal of Vascular Surgery as associate editor to oversee DEI efforts at the leadership level. The Vascular Specialist, a monthly SVS periodical, expanded its range and impact in partnership with BIBA Medical Publishing Group in the United Kingdom. An Audible Bleeding podcast was acquired and integrated into the SVS portfolio of publishing ventures, further broadening the message and audience for SVS communications. Currently, 2,000 Audible Bleeding podcasts are being downloaded each month. Across our social media portals, engagement increased dramatically, with none more than important than the nearly 1,000 new followers for @VascularSurgeon on Twitter, @FutureVascularSurgeon on Twitter, as highlighted in red. Our SVS tweet chat in May, focusing on radial artery access for vascular surgeons and vascular surgical interventions, received more than 360,000 impressions on Twitter. In the fall of 2020, the SVS launched a branding campaign in partnership with Springboard Communications with Joe Mills, Professor and Chief of Vascular Surgery at Baylor in Houston and a past Stanford Surgery Grand Round speaker. This campaign, with the tagline, "Today's Vascular Surgeon, Surgery is Only Part of Our Story," is increasing the visibility of the specialty as well as individual member practices nationwide. And the recently published Valuation Task Force report led by Rick Paul, Professor and Chief of Vascular Surgery at Dartmouth and another past Stanford Surgery Grand Round speaker, with data compiled in partnership with SG2, the consulting arm of Vizient, has quantified the value of vascular surgeons provide to their health systems and professional communities. The SVS strives to be worthy of the specialty we serve. Despite everything we've accomplished the past few years, we can and must do better. We must minimize bias, implicit or otherwise, in the workings or processes of the SVS. In one of the year's most highly cited business articles, Robert Livingston, writing in the Harvard Business Review, outlined a 5-step plan for maximizing organizational equity and inclusion, starting with problem awareness, root cause analysis, empathy, strategy, and sacrifice, summarized by the acronym PRESS. By commissioning and ultimately embracing the final report of the SVS Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force last summer, vascular surgery is pressing for change. Paraphrase the HBR, inclusive workplaces function as multivitamins, enabling everyone to reach their maximal career potential. In striving to be that organization for our members, this past March, we committed to achieving all the objectives highlighted in the Diversity Task Force led by Bernadette Olivola and John Eit. Our implementation plan, bottom right, identifies the SVS unit responsible for effecting change and the expected time frame for each DEI objective. We are already making good progress, starting from the top. A new SVS DEI committee was commissioned as an element of the organizational governance structure on par with committees such as Finance and Audit. Chaired by Vince Rowe, Professor and Program Director at USC, this committee is already contributing substantially to the work of the SVS. We created a diversity position statement, updated our mission statement, core values, and bylaws to reflect concordance with this document. We developed DEI educational resources for SVS members, including implicit bias training for leaders throughout the organization. We completed the first ever member census and developed metrics to track DEI progress across multiple domains annually. Since we cannot improve what we cannot measure, this year's benchmark will provide invaluable in the years going forward to help the SVS meet its DEI goals. In fact, progress is being made on nearly every priority outlined in this summary slide from the DEI report. Perhaps most representative is the recent evolution of our appointments committee process. Appointments are made by the appointments committee, executive board, or both. Participation opportunities center on appointment to one of our 30 committees outlined in red. Council membership is comprised of committee chair positions. Task forces are created for specific objectives within a limited time frame, usually a year or less. Writing groups and subcommittees are usually tasked with specific responsibilities from within their respective committees. Some committees like Finance, Audit, and DEI exist at a governance level outside of a council framework. Sections, a relatively new addition, also exist outside of traditional council framework. Finally, specific opportunities exist in either special projects or liaison responsibilities on behalf of the SVS. Traditionally, the Appointments Committee consisted of the President, a presidential line and support staff, including the President, President-elect, and Vice President. Over the past 3 years, we've expanded this to include representation from young surgeons, DEI, and community practice committees. Equally important is the expanded background and interest statements we request from volunteers. And starting this year, the limit of no more than 2 committee assignments allowed per member. Currently, 535 volunteer positions exist within the SVS. This year, 237 members volunteered for 164 open positions, resulting in a 63% successful committee appointment rate. Among current appointees, nearly 30% are female. By race and ethnicity, 15% are Asian, 6% are Hispanic, and 4% are Black. These percentages compare favorably with our membership demographic of 23% female, 14% Asian, 6% Hispanic, and 2% Black. Our growing diversity is equally well represented in committee and council leadership. Regarding gender specifically, 33% of chair positions are currently held by women. And these proportions did not change drastically this year, but rather represent the steady progress of intentional change over the last several years. This slide compares this year's percentages to the prior year. Reflecting our efforts to lower barriers to participation, fully 52% of 149 who received an appointment this year were not appointed to any committee last year, and nearly 40% had not been appointed to any SVS committee in the last 5 years, if ever. This year's appointments report, while encouraging, is a work in progress. Of those who were not appointed this year, 88 in total, no specific minority group or gender was disproportionately represented. And as was implemented last year, those not appointed to a committee this year will be given priority in next year's application cycle. Inclusion and equity go beyond being appointed to a committee or a discussion panel. However, inclusion and equity imply real responsibility for projects and processes of significance with sufficient training, preparation, and resources to ensure success. A frequently cited DEI meme refers to the practice of major orchestras employing blinded auditions to advance inclusion and equity in their ranks. In this scenario, musicians perform behind a screen to minimize the impact of appearance, racial, or gender bias on the selection process. In practice, however, as noted by Anthony Tomasini, writing in the New York Times this past summer, blinded auditions, while improving opportunities for women, have underperformed in most other DEI metrics. And referencing the New York Philharmonic specifically, there are fewer black musician principals now than there were in 1969, when black musicians first sued the Philharmonic for exclusion. As highlighted in the article, the skill required to even be invited to audition for major orchestra membership at this level nearly always ensures success for those ultimately selected. For the success and sustainability of competitive organizations like major orchestras, diversity, in addition to skill and professional commitment, needs to be an intentional consideration. What is needed to ensure equity and inclusion in the SVS isn't the opacity of a screen, but rather the increased resolution of an image intensifier, leveraging allyship, mentorship, stewardship, skills training, and opportunity for every member at every stage of their career to reach their full potential. To that end, this year we created and launched our leadership training program with direction from the Leadership Committee chaired by Melissa Kirkwood, Chief of Vascular Surgery at the University of Texas Southwestern, to prepare the new generation for their opportunity. This word cloud summarizes the feedback of the first cohort regarding their participation and perspectives on leadership in vascular surgery. As recently summarized by Captain Chelsea Sully Sullenberger, hope should not come from wishful thinking, but it should come from having actual capabilities based on real knowledge and skills. This is even more true in surgery than in aviation. With educational and career development opportunities like the new SVS Leadership Program, we are providing the means for members to embrace Dr. King's vision of hope based on real knowledge and skills, conquering disappointment. 77% of board-certified vascular surgeons are SVS members. Of those who are not, the majority are in their first 10 years in practice. Some young surgeons, when asked, express ambivalence about the SVS with comments like, "It's an old boys club," "I don't see anyone in leadership who looks like me," and "Their priorities are not aligned with my priorities." One senior SVS member told me he was discouraging his medical student daughter from considering a career in vascular surgery, let alone joining the SVS, in the aftermath of #MedBikini. To avoid irrelevance and decline, the SVS cannot be perceived as being that society, particularly by those who the organization is trying to recruit or those who should know the SVS best. New members are the lifeblood of any organization. Just as diversity and inclusion vaccinate us against implicit bias in our publishing ventures, so too are youthful perspective, ambition, and lived experience the keys to relevance and sustainability for the SVS. To that end, the SVS is advancing plans to create a young surgeon section limited to members in their first 10 years in practice. Young surgeon section goals include developing and maintaining a network of resources for young surgeons, including guidance on job searches, contract negotiations, how to advance in local, regional, and national leadership, and assessment and assistance in personal and professional development. Based on current demographics and the vascular surgery training pipeline, the young surgeon section could include up to 1,000 members. The section as proposed would subsume the existing Young Surgeons Committee and its leadership structure at the outset, including current chair Anita Chandra, and be housed outside of a specific council per section norms. Chelsea Dorsey of the University of Chicago, a graduate of the Stanford Integrated Vascular Surgery Residency Program, is a proposed new section leader. Close relationships are envisioned between clinical practice and education councils and many of their respective committees. We envision the Young Surgeon section working synergistically with like-minded organizations, including the program directors in vascular surgery, Society for Clinical Vascular Surgery, other vascular surgical societies nationwide, and the Rolu Club in Europe, and the regional vascular societies to achieve common goals within the relationship structure highlighted on this slide. Reflecting their importance within the SVS, section leadership will meet regularly with the executive board and nominate representatives to the SVS strategic board and appointments committees. To summarize, the SVS is working hard to become the fully inclusive and equitable society vascular surgeons need us to be. These initiatives will not and were not intended to promote critical race theory, rewrite history, or convey virtue signaling, but rather ensure that the SVS remains a viable and effective force for good far into the future. To circle back once again to the title of Dr. King's last book, where do we go from here? As Amanda Gorman so eloquently noted this past January, while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us. The world's first telegraph message posed the defining question for the dawn of the information age: what hath God wrought? Regarding vascular surgery, what hath the SVS wrought? Since 1947, the SVS created the modern specialty of vascular surgery. SVS meetings and publications have catalyzed steady improvement in surgical safety, quality, and clinical outcomes. The SVS championed objective, non-invasive vascular testing from its earliest days. The SVS raised public awareness of vascular disease and advocated for rigorous testing and credentialing standards in vascular postgraduate education. The lobbying arm of the SVS speaks for vascular surgeons and the patients we care for in Washington, D.C. And after decades of reducing death and disability from vascular disease, The SVS defines the global standard for vascular care. Sustainability, is defined by Summers and Smith, is a balance between well-being, leading a good life, social equity, all people leading some form of a good life, and intergenerational equity, future generations leading good lives. What brought the SVS to this point in its history, as impressive as its accomplishments are, won't be enough to sustain it through the next 75 years. The world will still need vascular specialists at the turn of the next century, and looking forward to the 150th anniversary of the SVS in 2096, the organization must evolve to ensure it remains relevant and effective in the decades to come. Vascular surgeons want to be the best at getting better. It's in our DNA. Better in our surgical technique, better in our patient care skills, better in our outcomes, better in our impact on our community, better in our ability to identify and develop talent. The future of the SVS, and by extension the specialty, depends on us getting this right. This year's Journal of Vascular Surgery supplement isn't the first attempt we've had at defining and prioritizing diversity, equity, and inclusion in the SVS. An earlier version, published in 2010, started the organization on this journey. As I stated in my introduction to the 2021 JVS Diversity Supplement published this summer, with this update, we take up the final recommendation of the 2010 supplement. That, in the words of prior supplement editors Fred Beavers and Bhagwan Satyani, the SVS must look inward and focus on the membership and leadership within. A laudable goal, they wrote, is for the SVS to be a diversity competent professional organization which will enable it to unleash the considerable talent that surely resides within its membership. Surely indeed, at the conclusion of my presidential year, I take pride in the fact that through intentional effort and redesign over the last 10 years, the SVS is several steps closer to this goal. It was an honor for me to serve as president of this distinguished organization this year. I'm grateful as well to predecessors and current colleagues on the SVS Executive Board for their support and encouragement, and to the SVS staff for their resilience and commitment to our mission. The SVS is headquartered in Rosemont, Illinois. I was just there yesterday, a few miles from O'Hare Airport, and a building we share with the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons, AAOS. Ironically enough, due to the pandemic, throughout my year as president, I never once set foot in the headquarters building or had a face-to-face meeting with the staff or the executive board. But we did manage to pull off our annual meeting this August in San Diego with 1,100 in-person attendees, of whom only 3 ultimately tested positive for COVID during or in the 2 weeks following the meeting. I'm grateful that Dr. Hahn was able to attend my presidential address, post-address reception, and after-party. Stanford was vastly overrepresented in all phases of the meeting, including a named lectureship for Dr. Elsie Ross, and numerous podium presentations, awards, and section leadership responsibilities. A fitting tribute to our division and department and the history of vascular surgery at Stanford University. This summer also marked the end of my 16-year run as vascular division chief. I'm thankful to our outstanding faculty who allowed me to devote the time I needed to serve the SVS as president this past year. That gratitude extends to our clinic and academic support staff as well, working together seamlessly to support our practice, without whom we would not be able to provide the comprehensive vascular care our patients need and deserve. Just prior to the beginning of my presidential term in the spring of 2020, before anyone understood the full impact of the evolving pandemic, I was asked in an interview for the vascular specialist about my goals for the coming year. What actually transpired was dramatically different than what I anticipated, but in retrospect, I'm proud of what we've accomplished and the path the SVS is on now to sustainability and continued relevance in the coming decades. And honestly, I can't imagine a more impactful contribution than our enhanced focus on equity and inclusion. One of the great joys of academic surgical practice is the ability to engage with and contribute to professional organizations like the SVS. I encourage all of you, if you aren't already engaged, to find your organization and your opportunity to contribute, regardless of your specialty focus. It's through these engagements that true professional fulfillment, in my experience, is achieved. Thank you for your attention this morning, and here's hoping for the end of the pandemic and full resumptions of the rhythms of academic life this year. Thank you.